Hi friends, host Eric here, and in this part 2 video, I would like to go over Dr. Russell Blakely's presentation on ADD. I'll link to the video as well, the one that I watched, which is about emotion. But I just want to make sure to cover here the stuff that's not specific to that topic in the video, but rather the general stuff he tells us about ADD, ADHD, okay? First of all, ADD and ADHD are totally different things, according to him. ADD, technically the name of it is sluggish cognitive processing, or something like that. Regardless, it's not what people think I have. ADHD is basically the opposite. What's called ADD has nothing to do with ADHD, according to Russell Blakely, except for the fact that they come in through ADD clinics because they both come in for the same practical reason: poor school performance. Okay, some facts about ADHD, again, according to this doctor. First of all, it's important to note that it's not a psychopathology. A psychopathology doesn't need a metric that's relative. It uses a relative measure in order to attain its data. Rather, it is a developmental delay or a developmental disorder. ADHD is, and it is neurological in nature, having to do with the brain and stuff like that. So what's the difference between psychopathology then and a developmental delay or a developmental disorder? Well, psychopathology is gross, which means it expresses outwardly in a way that is obvious to anybody looking at it. It doesn't require a metric that compares against an age. So in the psychopathology one, you need an age metric. You don't need an age metric. If you are, for example, let's say you are born with some sort of severe mental retardation, and you, at age 3, you still show no signs at all of walking, talking, anything like that. Well, you don't need to say, well, they're this far behind the benchmarks. This is a bad example. But here's a good example. If you're talking about what's called, I can't forget the name. It's not oppositional disorder. That's the light one. The heavy one is, I forget what it's called. They'll come back to me. But the point is, if you have that thing, then your kid, like say you're a 10-year-old kid or something, and you got oppositional disorder, but the hardcore one. Well, then you're going to be like punching kids in the face and stuff. And it's not that you're having a problem for your developmental stage. That's a problem at any stage. So that's a psychopathology. A developmental delay or developmental disorder has to use that age metric because it's not immediately obvious. So the doctor indicates that there are primarily deficits in a couple of areas. But if you had to come up with a single overriding term to describe ADHD, you would describe it as a metacognitive executive deficit. And it's also a problem of persistence. People with ADHD are challenged in persisting towards in a given course, along a given course, which of course is required if one is to complete the course upon which one walks. Another thing he says is that really, he goes around and he describes it in a few different ways here. He says, it's executive deficits, it's an issue of persistence, they can't string together sufficient complex chains of action to attain pursued future outcomes. they are highly field sensitive. Field sensitivity means that the environment around them is more likely to interrupt them and take their attention away from what they are currently doing. Inability and willingness and reflexive tendency towards changing course. Okay, so they have only a few different actual, in the DSM, they only have a few different indicators that the psychologist can look for and say, okay, well, check that box, check that box, okay, you have ADHD. And they're all verbal. And they have to do with verbal outbursts, inappropriate language at inappropriate times, stuff like that. Okay. And the doctor insists that this is a travesty, that the DSM needs to include all sorts of different things into the possible symptoms of ADHD, including less likely to re-engage goals once they've been interrupted, and having trouble with this process he calls remembering so as to do. ADHD individuals are known to have a high time preference. What that means is they have steeper discounting when it comes to the natural way that all humans value less positive things that are going to be attained the further away in time they are from you. All humans have this trait. It's called temporal discounting. And ADHD people have it steeper discounting. They're more likely to be excessively off task. There's disinhibition of verbal and motor. I don't know exactly why I wrote that down. Disinhibition, how? I didn't write down enough information to tell you what that means. Alright, so he also says this developmental delay is two-dimensional. It expresses in two specific dimensions, those dimensions being nature and nurture. He says there's a genetic component to it, there's a social component as well. He points out that this is a disorder that is determined by quantity, not quality. If I have a dead fetus attached to my head, like in that one episode of South Park, that is not something that is quantitative. It's not like, well, it's normal to have some dead fetus on your head, but not that much. That's not the issue, right? It's binary. It's either right or wrong. You might think of what just happened there as me displaying my field sensitivity. Because Compton was trying to say, let me out. And I knew if I didn't go later, I was just going to keep doing it. So, okay. It's a quantitative, not a qualitative difference. Well, how do you know whether something ought to be treated that way differently? Like, how do you know if it's qualitative or quantitative? Well, it's simple. Certain things are binary and certain things are sliding scale. And the way you can tell descriptively which is which is that binary ones compare against a standard and sliding scale compare against compare relationally. It's not exactly relative, but it's relational. Okay. So, if you're wondering how do you determine, though, in the first place, if you don't know, if you're not describing, but instead trying to decide which is which you should use, all right, well, that's going to be dependent on the dimension of the point in question. if it's a normative point, if it's a pragmatic point, it depends on that stuff. All right, so he defines attention as a bundle of working memory deficits. He says ADHD, the attention part of ADHD refers to not just what we might as lay people consider attention, but rather what scientists would deem as the full array of elements that make up the composite attention. It says it's a bundle of working memory deficits combined with a failure of a language to string behavior together over time to reach a goal. In other words, it's a failure of language to modify behavior that normally individuals will use language one way or the other. They'll by knowing words that indicate to them, here are consequences, this is important, I have to do this, yada yada yada, and somehow this is going to modify their behavior, and thus if the behavior remains unmodified, it must be a failure among at least those two things. Working memory deficits and language. An inability of language to modify behavior. Okay, so cross-modal, which means that it's vastly more complex than what the DSM indicates, according to Dr. Russell. And the last thing I have on my papers here is this. Is that it? This is what I was looking for. This is the problem with taking notes. Oh, he said the main reason they didn't add more disorders or more symptoms into the disorder description in the DSM, which is the psychology, official psychology disease book or something, is because they didn't want to increase the prevalence of the disorder. So they don't like the fact that so many people are prescribed medication for ADD or ADHD, and is what I should call it, because they're totally different according to that guy. Prevalence management, he said. There was a concern of prevalence management. What? I'll get into that next video. High time preference, which means we have a high preference, ADHD people do, for short-term things and not medium-term or sort of short-term. Just really short-term is preferable. Additionally, it gives us an interesting description of an emotion. It says an emotion is a short-duration change in arousal, motivation, or alertness. That's a psychological definition of it, according to him, the official sort of psychology definition. He says that emotions are very useful, not just for self-control, not just for catharsis, but for arousal management, communication, self-control. All these things are important to have a good handle on your emotions. He talks about a process of developing emotional tools in life. Number one, first when you're born you feel your emotion. Next, you learn to suppress your emotion. And you can see little kids when they're trying not to cry, or me. Actually, I don't really try not to cry that much. I just let it come out. But then the third thing they learn is to calm themselves down. Again, you can see that in kids. They'll rock back and forth or something, or and sort of like curl up in the ball and stuff like that. Suck their thumb, stuff like that. And then after we learn that, to calm ourselves down, we learn the next trick, which is to focus elsewhere. And that means just pay attention to something else, basically, and try to forget about the emotion, try to distract yourself away from it. And then the very last trick we learned about emotions is to replace the emotion we have with one of our choosing by manufacturing it in the way that actors do, by thinking of something really sad or by thinking of something really happy. Alright, so that's all I'm going to say about his presentation. It was good. I learned a lot about the status quo, legitimate science on the matter. But I didn't feel like he went in depth enough, so I additionally took the liberty of examining some PDFs. And I will bring those up on the screen. Oh, did I close them? I guess I closed them. Anyway, I'll bring it back up. So one of the things he said in the video, funny I didn't even mention this, he was talking about, well, is in fact there a difference in the brain architecture, what's going on, stuff like that. So one of the things I learned from this process of looking at these PDFs was that there's a great deal of difficulty in isolating the things that they say individuals might have a deficit in. And there's been a shift in recent years from the old model, which was geographical and said this region of the brain is responsible for that region of the brain. And that change in perspective has been to move to an understanding that in fact the models shift the focus of the assumed pathology from regional brain abnormalities to dysfunction and distributed network organization. So you're going to hear a lot about these networks. So this is what the scientists refer to as neural connections between different regions of the brain. That's what they mean by structural and functional connectivity. Now this is really an interesting article here. So first it says this: given the associated burden to society, family, and the individual child, understanding the causes of ADHD and developing new and more effective treatments targeting these underlying causes is an important goal for neuroscience research. Okay, so although it clearly points to a neurological basis for the disorder, the pathophysiological mechanisms of ADHD and the specific nature of the atypical brain development underlying it remain poorly understood. Recently, in concordance with emerging concepts in other neuropsychiatric disorders, a change in perspective has occurred. These models shift the focus from abnormalities to dysfunctions in distributed network organization. While the assessment of functional segregation in the human brain, i.e. the localization of regionally specific functions, has been the predominant concept in imaging neuroscience for many years, the pathophysiology of neuropsychiatric disorders is now being increasingly treated from a systems perspective in which function emerges from an interaction of regionally specialized elements. As a result, the analysis of brain connectivity has become more and more critical. However, the analysis of each of these three fundamental aspects of brain connectivity, namely anatomical, functional, and affective connectivity, is associated with its own technical and conceptual challenges. Finally, we will discuss how a systems perspective might impact our understanding of the development of ADHD pathology and how such a systems perspective can be addressed in future connectivity studies. All right, so they talk about the various challenges here for the methodology and how they don't really have the tools they need to have. Talk about some various options they have. One of which uses the water, like the viscosity of water and white matter, basically. Typical development. So this is where we get interesting a little bit again. Fair et al. Showed that the default network structure in children deviates slightly from that seen in healthy adults. Comparable to adults, interhemispheric functional connections between homotopic regions appear to be relatively strong in children. Okay, so what this means is that normally an adult brain has got its different regions assigned to shit. And the extent to which the different regions can communicate with each other is less in adults than it is in kids. And the reason is this thing called small world systems analysis, or small world network topology, which has been demonstrated in many complex networks, including social economics, biological networks. Recent advances in graph theoretical approaches allow the characterization of topological properties of complex networks. Using these approaches, those guys have shown the graphs with dense local connections and few long connections can be characterized as small world networks. Small world network topology has been demonstrated in many complex networks. Okay, so using this small world approach, they recently reported that normal development of functional connectivity is characterized by simultaneous reduction of local circuitry and strengthening of long-range connectivity. Importantly, the study showed that this is a general developmental principle that operates at the level of the entire brain and not just in circumscribed nodes of attentional control and default mode networks, as previously demonstrated. Findings are therefore consistent with regard to distributed changes in large-scale network properties during development. Detailed comparison between studies, however, is difficult due to a lack of correspondence between the underlying data structures. Although they analyze the connectivity, focus their analysis on task control regions. These findings suggest that changes in functional integration and segregation are closely intertwined with wiring distance, which may reflect a general principle of brain development. They also demonstrate that the dynamic process of overconnectivity followed by a pruning which rewires connectivity at the neuronal level also operates at the systems level. Recently it was shown that maturation was attained by adolescents in broadly distributed association and projection fibers, including those supporting critical and brainstem integration that may underlie known enhancements in reaction time that occur during this period. Maturation after adolescence occurred in association and projection tracts, including prefrontal striatal connections known to support top-down executive control of behavior and interhemispheric connectivity. Maturation proceeded in parallel with pubertal changes to the post-pubertal stage, suggesting hormonal influences on white matter development. Atypical development of connectivity in ADHD. The majority of functional imaging studies in patients with ADHD have focused on the use of various cognitive activation paradigms. As can be seen, These study results show some inconsistencies that deserve further comment. First, the heterogeneity of findings might reflect differences in methodology, or they might reflect your mom's face, such as choice of seed ROIs, considerations of anti-correlations, or might result from artifacts generated by the use of typically small samples. Further, it is in line with currently held concepts of large heterogeneity among ADHD subjects. It is also possible the heterogeneity of the DMN findings simply mirrors the cognitive energetic variability that is often claimed to be one of the fundamental cognitive dysfunctions in ADHD. Evidence for deviant connectivity patterns. Only a very limited number of studies have investigated the functional interactions of different brain regions during cognitive tasks. Increased functional connectivity between the right prefrontal cortex, the left dorsal cingulate cortex, and the left conaris was found in ADHD adults. So, one of the first studies to examine adults with ADHD found evidence for lower connectivity between the bilateral anterior cingulate superior parietal lobe. Fucking brain words are stupid. And the cerebellum during a working memory task in these patients compared to healthy controls. In contrast, increased functional connectivity in this other area. Okay, I think we've read enough of this. It's interesting to see what they say. I did read already about some of this stuff about how the drugs impact you. So you get the idea. All right. Hopefully, I've said enough about it. I've made its case, sort of, to the extent that it has a case to be made. Okay. Now I'm going to do part 3.